Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is a very exciting occasion. Not only are we welcoming Dimitar Gueorguiev, but this is the first in-person public lecture that 21st Century China Center is doing for 2 years. So I'm really particularly happy to welcome the folks in the audience. I'm happy to welcome all of you, those on Zoom, as well as those in person, but particularly those in person. It's great to be with you. Dimitar is an associate professor in political science at Syracuse University. He received his PhD from the political science department here at UC San Diego. This is his second book. His previous book, China's Governance Puzzle, I would also recommend to you highly. This new book is really a wonderful book with a lot of insights about what's actually happening beneath the headlines in China. And so I urge you, including the Zoom people, to get the book and to read it for yourselves. But now it's a distinct pleasure to welcome Dimitar to give his talk on the book. And then after he speaks, we'll have questions from the in-person audience and then from the Zoom audience. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Susan Sherrick. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center. Now, Dimitar.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, UCSD, for inviting me back home. Mm-hmm. It's a pleasure to be here, surrounded with former friends, maybe future friends, my mentor, Susan. And so it's really great to be here with all of you today. So I guess what I'll do is, I wasn't sure how to go about doing the talk portion of this book, so I ended up trying to do everything. I'll try and give you kind of a snapshot summary of what's in the book, with some background at the beginning, and then what I'm really looking forward to most is the discussion afterwards and your questions. So just to kind of frame set all this, when we think about the PRC. There's a kind of a strong image of top-down control that we associate with a single-party authoritarian state. But this image kind of ignores the fact that a lot of that top-down control is facilitated by the actions of hundreds of millions of individual Chinese citizens who are both, in a way, kind of participants and collaborators in policy, but they're also, in many cases, the victims of policy. And so what I try to do in this book is to try and understand kind of, what role citizens have in the Chinese party state, and what I have been documenting for years now, both in the first book that Susan mentioned, which I'll talk about in just a second, and in this book is kind of the wide range of arenas in which Chinese citizens are participants in things like policy implementation, the campaign to contain COVID, the campaign to root out corruption in the party, in the state, petitions, complaints, even protests, right, are ways in which Chinese citizens can participate short of more democratic methods of participation. But there's still examples of people voicing their preferences, expressing their grievances. And there's more structured formats as well. I'll talk a little bit today about notice and comment campaigns, which are very structured, open debates that the state opens for a moment and then closes back down whenever they're considering new policy changes. And of course, I already mentioned anti-corruption, the oversight that a authoritarian regime needs to conduct in order to resolve what are pretty classical agency problems in a large organization. And so again, the question that's kind of motivating this research in this book is, what is the role of bottom-up participation in a top-down authoritarian system? And the conclusion, kind of the takeaway from all this is that bottom-up participation inside the authoritarian system ultimately serves top-down control. I argue that they're complementary, and I think that that's not perhaps particularly novel, but it is a different way of thinking about public inclusion in an authoritarian system, and I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. I'll also share with you some potential mechanisms by which popular participation and public inclusion could facilitate top-down control, whether that be by augmenting the capacity of the state, providing useful information to the state, or imbuing its policies with an added legitimacy than they might otherwise have if they were conducted behind closed doors. So this book also follows on an earlier book that Susan mentioned called China's Governance Puzzle, which was published in 2017. And the puzzle for this book was, how is it that after more than 3 decades of really unparalleled growth and dynamism in the Chinese political economy, our measures of institutional quality, institutional integrity had really not budged at all? Right? Was there something that was missing? Were we not measuring the right variables? Were we looking in the wrong places? And so this book was, this co-authored book was, a data gathering exercise to try and figure out, are there components of Chinese governing institutions that have changed, that have adapted to the new environment? And by and large, we came to the conclusion that things have shifted. Public participation has increased. Government transparency, oddly enough, has increased. There is so much information that you can access today on the Chinese civil service, on procurement by the government. So if there's graduate students here in the room, the sky is the limit in terms of things that you can really get your hands on and start studying in an interesting way. At the same time, the premise that that we approached those types of changes in the Chinese political system was one that was grounded in kind of an import theory of institutions, whereby quasi-democratic institutions are being imported from outside, from the West, and then incorporated, made to work somehow in the Chinese context. Okay? And that presented, potentially optimistic conclusions in some ways. Maybe these imports could be stepping stones to further liberalization, further reform. And that's clearly not what has happened. Right? The last 10 years in particular have pretty clearly demonstrated that democracy or moves toward democracy are the last thing that the administration is thinking about. And it's very unlikely that we would see things shifting in that direction, given where things stand right now. On the contrary, we've seen Xi Jinping come in and concentrate power rather than disperse it, re-centralize authority rather than decentralize it. And this made me wonder whether any of the reforms that we had been studying were ever democratic to begin with. And so what I'm doing in Retrofitting Leninism is kind of starting from a different basis point. And I'm really thinking about these institutions as being authoritarian institutions. Public participation being an authoritarian form of inclusion. And in particular, I spent a long time going back to the roots of the Chinese political system and the Leninist legacies that gave rise to it. And what I came away from in that deep dive is that Leninism is quite unique in several ways. First, there is a distinction, kind of an interesting distinction in Leninist thought about the vanguard party as a separate entity from the administrative state. There is also a very detailed blueprint for organizing society, organizing the economy, organizing the political space in very well sequestered, atomized groups based on jurisdiction, based on interests, based on production capacity. And so it's a very kind of convoluted organizational scheme. And finally, Leninism has a unique preoccupation with getting the public to participate in policy making and policy implementation. And as I started kind of appreciating those aspects of Leninism more, it dawned on me that the types of reforms that my co-authors and I were exploring in China's governance puzzle were not that foreign to some of the Leninist ideals of the past. And when I tried to kind of think about how Leninism had developed in China and in the other kind of Marxist-Leninist regimes that came out in the 20th century, what we're most familiar with is the failure of these systems to deliver on their ambitions. Most Leninist systems today are extinct for a reason, which is that the type of complex organizational structure, the desire to kind of include people in the process, but then also control the process, is only sustainable in early stages. Once an economy is actually successful and starts to develop, starts to become more dynamic, the challenge of, or the computational challenge of control becomes insurmountable. And that's partly what we see in China. And we've seen periods of real challenge in terms of the state trying to make good on its obligations, providing public services, maintaining prices within planned constraints. And so there were times where it looked like the PRC was headed the same way as many of its Leninist peers who have collapsed. But that hasn't happened. And in trying to understand how it hasn't happened and why it hasn't happened, I couldn't ignore kind of the importance of the information revolution and the technological revolution that we're all part of over the last few decades, which I argue in the book has really kind of given Leninism a new lifeline by making both aspects of this kind of desire for authoritarian control and a desire to involve people in the process much more feasible and much less costly. I want to spend just a moment talking about this dilemma of control, and the kind of the classical paradox for control is that authoritarian regimes are insecure by design. They face threats from above, elite struggles, competition from above, or unrest from below. And the control paradox is that you can try to repress and create an exclusive regime that is isolated, or at least protected from these threats, by empowering a small coalition of necessary supporters, by fragmenting the military, by putting restrictions on the economy. And in those ways, you can exert more control over the system and protect yourself. But that has the unfortunate consequences of undermining development. Alternatively, you can create a more inclusive system which fosters development, but that undermines control. And so that's kind of the paradox here. And what I'm trying to argue with my theory of controlled inclusion in retrofitting Leninism is that you can, in some ways, create bounded arenas for public participation in government, open markets within controlled spaces. And that these kind of controlled spaces then can facilitate development, but you're not going to be stuck in the paradox where you're losing control as you're developing. And so, that's kind of the real kicker, is that China's been able to open up its economy, allow its people to travel around the world, allow information to come in and out, not entirely freely, but at a very large rate, and still maintain control throughout the process. And kind of as a theoretical diagram of what I'm trying to say here is that when we think about kind of these dual ambitions, one to control and one to be inclusive, we actually have a lot of variation, and we have some regimes that are capable of exerting high levels of control, but are very exclusive in terms of who is involved in the decision-making, who's in charge of that control structure, and we could call this a police state. We also have authoritarian regimes that have tried to be inclusive without the requisite amounts of control, and then yes, that was successful for perhaps for some goals like economic development, but ultimately it was unsustainable in terms of an authoritarian control prerogative. And so these are just some examples here. The data that I'm borrowing here comes from Sheena Greetnitz's book, or some of it does. Some of it is original data on the amount of regime presence within the population. So we can think about this in terms of state security presence within the average population. And so there's a few countries, a few regimes that have actually been pretty high on both levels of public inclusion, public participation, and very high in terms of the presence of the regime as a control apparatus within the political economy. And the two that stand out are the ROC. So this was Taiwan under its authoritarian regime, and the PRC, which is the subject of today. There's also variation within China. And so this gives you kind of a measure of kind of control, which is approximated as security spending per capita at the provincial level, and then ability or kind of stated ability of citizens to be able to voice opinions on policy, express grievances. And we can see that some places like Shanghai, Zhejiang, Jiangsu are pretty high on both, whereas other places like Tibet and Xinjiang clearly have much more control than they do inclusion. So it's not a one-size-fits-all type of argument about China. Now, this idea that control.
Are you going to say what inclusion,
yeah,
what the measure of inclusion is here?
So this measure of inclusion is an aggregate indicator pulled from data from the China General Social Survey, as well as a large-scale netizen survey that asks questions about, do you feel capable of participating in local politics? Have you contacted your government before with a request? And so it's an aggregate measure of composite
Survey data.
Yeah, survey data. And the kind of, I guess, the most important part of my argument, again, is that control and inclusion can have these kind of complementary features to one another. And the example that I wanted to point to here is information. So traditional literature on authoritarianism basically sees an autocrat or a dictator as being information poor. They just don't have enough information because people are not telling them the truth. People are hiding the truth, and there aren't mechanisms like a free press or regional elections that could inform them or cue them into potential problems. And so the classical literature on authoritarianism is all about how can autocrats and dictators overcome this incomplete information problem. But I think that today, we're really in an information-rich environment where, in many instances, there's perhaps too much information. There's perhaps a lot of irrelevant information. It's hard for decision makers to know what to do with all of this information. If we're talking about China, we're talking about hundreds of millions of complaints every year, petitions, proposals. How do you sort all of this information out? And a lot of that information is probably going to be very biased. People are going to be telling you, what they want you to hear, or they're going to be telling you skewed information and in an attempt to get more resources to themselves. And so it makes sense that from a control regime's perspective, you would want mechanisms or you would want information structured in a way that it was reductive. So you could figure out, okay, what is all this? What are all these complaints telling me? What are all these proposals calling for? And that it's robust to the kind of the biases and the manipulations of the people that are providing that information. And so you can put in controls in the system that make the information processing challenge, or kind of the challenge of dealing with too much information, less difficult. And they don't necessarily need to be overtly repressive. You can, for example, set up agenda controls, which say, okay, well, for the next 30 days, we're going to have an open discussion on the property tax. And we will allow for people to voice competing preferences, complain about things. But after that period, then it'll stop. Right? Or, maybe it's a new labor contract law, and the agenda dictates that for a period of time, we will get input from businesses and employers, and for a period of time, we'll get input from workers. And you dictate how the conversation transpires. You can also implement coordination controls, which prevent people from discussing with one another about the issues that are open for debate. So in the Chinese legislature, for instance, which is supposed to be a constituency organization where delegates are supposed to represent particular sectors or geographies, there are strict limits on delegates being able to talk to one another. You can talk within your own delegation, but having a conversation with somebody in another delegation is actually potentially risky, and it's costly. And there's kind of logistical measures taking place to make it difficult for people to be able to reach one another. And there's also a wide variety of screening controls, which there can be potential costs, for example, for protesting or writing a petition. And those kind of screening costs, this is something that a colleague of mine, Peter Leninist, talks about, make sure that only people who are, have a real problem and feel strongly enough about it would take on those risks and those costs to voice it. And so these controls end up reducing the amount of information, and as I'll argue in a little bit, may also provide heuristics for trying to isolate important pieces of information from what may be less important noise. So the book, there's 8 core chapters sandwiched in between an introduction and a conclusion, and they're separated into 3 parts. The first part is just laying out the theoretical framework, but also providing some of the historical background. So if anybody's interested in kind of the history of control and inclusive institutions in China, or the Soviet Union for that matter, there's a chapter on that. In part 2, I talk about kind of the transmission belt between bottom-up inputs and top-down outputs, and I look at it in 3 different areas. One is oversight, so I'll talk about anti-corruption and supervision. The other is policymaking and planning, and also prioritization of information inputs. And then in part 3, I look at some of the downstream implications of this argument in terms of, well, okay, if there is a connection between public inclusion and government policy, what are the consequences? Is that policy more durable? Is it more legitimate? And given the way that technology is playing an increasingly important role in facilitating inclusion, what are the kind of the technological frontiers moving forward? So the data in the book involves a lot of public polling data, which I conducted via a survey I started called the China Policy Barometer. So if there's anybody here who's interested in survey data on China, you can get in touch with me. I think UCSD is doing something similar with the China Data Lab. There's also field survey evidence. There's a lot of observational data in terms of corruption investigations, legislative activity, and legal and administrative records. And there's also some field work that I did in sites, local government sites, also information offices and municipal centers in China, and interviews with Chinese officials, average citizens, and some NGOs that are kind of intermediaries in this inclusion process. So this is a little blurry here, but this is kind of a research snapshot that I wanted to show is, you can see trends in, here we're looking at corruption investigations in the dark line, in the dashed line, and citizen complaints about corruption in the dark line. And here we see the same, but the dashed line is actual punitive actions, disciplinary actions against officials. And what you see is that there's trending across, but you see closer trending around 2008. And this is a time where you get a concerted push from the State Council and other offices, disciplinary offices, and the Ministry of Supervision to try and incorporate public input into the investigative process. And so, there's a correlation here. And in the book, I spent quite a bit of time, if anybody's interested, in trying to figure out whether this correlation is spurious or if there's any causal link between these trends using statistical approaches that I'm happy to talk about later. This is data on different policies that the China Policy Barometer was designed to kind of gauge the public mood on. And the way this was organized was, as most of you may know, China has an annual legislative session that is actually taking place, concluding right now, where the legislature passes and approves policy directions. But we know the plan for these discussions in advance. And we also know which of these policies have been opened up to public consultation and public input and which have not. And so what I did with the China Policy Barometer was I surveyed public opinion on both opened and closed policies. And I just try to see, okay, do we see more congruence in the ultimate decisions on policies that were open to discussion versus those that were closed? And just kind of eyeballing it, there is some evidence that there's a higher percentage of congruence on policies where there was open discussion and open debate versus those that were decided behind closed doors. What we see here is a coefficient plot where we're looking at determinants of encompassing policy proposals. And what an encompassing policy proposal, these are bottom-up proposals. These are initiated by deputies at the local level, legislative deputies at the local level, who are advocating for some new law or a new initiative or new resources. And what makes them encompassing is that they are not parochial. They cover a broader region. They help groups outside of their constituencies. And what you see here is one of the largest predictors is the geographic diversity of the people signing on to these proposals. And what I'm trying to get at here is that it's very hard for people from different constituencies to actually come together, have a discussion with one another, trust one another enough to say, I support your initiative. But when they do, it typically is on broader, more encompassing proposals. And further on, these encompassing proposals are more likely to get picked up by the legislative leadership and potentially put into law and implemented. Here I look at kind of what happens to different policies, both administrative and legal policies, depending on whether they were conducted in an open environment or in a closed environment. And what I'm comparing here is across different jurisdictions in China. So China is a large country. Whenever there's a large policy reform, it has to get implemented in each jurisdiction across the country. So every province is going to have its own version of a new compulsory education law. Prefectures will have their own version. And so what I'm doing is comparing across similar policies in different jurisdictions, some that had an open process for deciding, the terms of the policies and the implementation plan, and those that did it without any sort of consultation. And what you see is a pretty dramatic difference in terms of the appeal of the repeal and amendment rates for closed policies versus those that were conducted in the open. This is data from a kind of an experimental township in coastal Zhejiang, where participants were randomly selected from the community's residents to come in and deliberate on potential budget items that could be funded for the next year using discretionary funds. And it's not a big deal. The amount of money wasn't huge, but the process of being included in that decision-making process was apparently quite influential in terms of the way people thought about their role in the system. They felt like they had much more efficacy. They were much more satisfied with the local government. They perceived the local government as being less corrupt than they did previously, and when compared to a similar random sample of residents who were not invited. And so there is a kind of a legitimacy component here, even if it's a very kind of constrained and curated affair. And then finally, I wanted to kind of think about, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the technological frontiers of this form of controlled inclusion. And one of the recent developments that some of you may have heard about is kind of the establishment of something called a social crediting system, which is unique in many ways. For me, what's most unique about it is that unlike previous forms of monitoring, surveillance, and coercion in China, it's a system of total surveillance. In theory, everybody would be part of the social crediting system. Everybody would have their own social credit score and their own history backed by that score. And it's a pretty invasive system, but it's also one that finds quite a lot of support. About 80% of Chinese citizens support the establishment of this kind of social crediting system. And a lot of it, I think, and others have found similar conclusions, that it has to do with a belief that it could resolve problems of credibility and trust within the Chinese system. People don't necessarily trust each other when engaging in financial transactions, and such a system could potentially come in and fill the gap. But one of the interesting things that I found it particularly interesting is that the biggest predictor of whether people supported the adoption of this arguably pretty invasive surveillance system is that they thought that they were trusted by the government. Right? they felt like they were good citizens. They felt like this is not going to be a problem for me. It's going to be a problem for all the other people who are not good citizens, who don't pay their bills on time, who don't follow the rules, but not me, right? And so this idea of entrustment, I think, is really important in sustaining public participation in what is a pretty controlled system. And I didn't put the results here, but the thing about the social crediting system is that that's not the case. There aren't trusted members or untrusted members, right? Everybody's participating in the same measurement system. Everybody's being evaluated under the same metrics. And so when you present people with that information, the idea that their behaviors, their records, their financial transactions, their interactions with their friends, their colleagues, their neighbors are being tracked, monitored, and then enumerated with some sort of score, they actually, first of all, they reduce the amount by which they think that they are trusted by the government, and they also are less interested in supporting the system. And so, one of the kind of the speculative kind of interpretations that I take from this finding is that as China is moving increasingly into what people now colloquially call digital authoritarianism, right, where they rely on computers, big data, passive surveillance to try and understand, what people were doing, where they're congregating, what they're talking about, what they're complaining about. You're going to lose this kind of human connection that I think has sustained a very high rate of voluntary participation within the Chinese public. And I see that potentially as a risk in the way China studies the technology. So, can we skip to the next slide? Yeah, so kind of the broader takeaways from all this, I think we're running a little short on time, is that, if you wanted to take away anything from the book, the first thing is that when we think about reforms in China, reforms that might seem democratic, might seem kind of progressive, I don't think democracy is the right frame set for understanding them, because they're also kind of consistent with Leninist ideas, authoritarian ideas about the public's role in the governing process. Second, I try to make a strong case that we don't need to be worried about autocrats not having enough information anymore. I think that we've passed that. Technology has moved us past that problem, and increasingly the challenge is going to be for governments, democratic and undemocratic alike, is figuring out how to use large amounts of information effectively, efficiently, and try to isolate meaningful priorities from that. And then thinking forward, in the last chapter, in the conclusion, I talk about the challenges that China is facing today. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with concerns about demographics, concerns about slowing growth, concerns about carbon markets. These are types of problems that are actually quite amenable to a controlled system that forces people to, buy into insurance schemes, that distributes resources from one group to another. So it's actually kind of a unique infrastructure that China has in place that is well positioned for the tasks ahead. But again, I think that there are concerns that maybe the success that China has had in using technology to kind of augment both control and facilitate public input is moving in a direction that's increasingly kind of passive. It's not person to person, and that maybe could result in people not participating anymore. We're starting to see that already, I think, with the COVID campaign in China, where people are not reporting the way that they were reporting a year ago. People are hiding information because they understand that this is they are a target as well.
Well, thanks so much. Very ambitious and very
very interesting. I was actually going to start off where you ended on COVID.
Mhm.
Because I was wondering if the experience of the way the Chinese government has managed the population through COVID has taught you anything or surprised you or even challenges some of your preconceptions or your findings, earlier findings, especially on the connection between technological surveillance and then the role of all of these party members and other agents of the party, community leaders. I mean, what was interesting to me was that a lot of the way that society was organized even before 49, before liberation, but then right up through the Mao era as well, with a lot of people's neighbors kind of watching them and helping them, and as well as controlling them.
Mhm.
And so to me, the human side was very prominent at the same time as they were developing even newer technologies for watching movements of people and contact between people and other things. So, what did you learn that's related to your conclusions from the COVID experience?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and kind of the pre-CCP era. I guess the difference then was that even though that was taking place at the local level, there wasn't a direct link between the local level and leaders. And that was during the imperial period, it was during the KMT period. It was only when the CCP really kind of embedded itself at the local level that you had kind of a loyal grassroots that was connected to the region. And with COVID, I mean, I think COVID in many ways validated some of the assumptions that I had here. It was quite astounding how much information people were volunteering, whether it was personal information about how they were feeling that day, which they're reporting on these apps, their temperatures, but also on their neighbors, right? This was a very large scale kind of surveillance system that was facilitated with input from individuals. And yeah, it involved party actors and state actors, but it also involved the neighborhood watchman, the person who managed the gate, the taxi drivers who were collecting information on who was going where and when, and providing that. So I think that what we saw was this kind of controlled inclusion and action, at least in the beginning stages and through up until recently. I think what's happening right now is that they were so successful in using this mechanism that they're probably overusing it. And it's become kind of a political point. This idea of zero COVID has now become not a policy position, but a political position, and arguably, a not very sustainable one. And I think that this is one of the risks, is that when you have a tool that works well, you overuse it. And I think what we're starting to see now is that people there's still, I think, quite a bit of pride within the Chinese public about its ability to combat COVID. But there's also, I think, a lot of exhaustion, and there's a lot of reluctance now to participate in volunteering information.
Because if you do, you're going to be quarantined
Yeah, if you do, you're going
for
to be
such a
quarantined.
long period of time.
Yeah, it's excessive, and it's unsurprising that people are hiding information. They don't want to be associated with anybody, and they're not sharing it even privately anymore with friends and colleagues either.
Mm-hmm.
You get sick and then you disappear for a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay, other questions from the in-person audience? We're gonna start back there.
What's your opinion of President Xi?
Um,
Well,
What-
are you interested in any particular dimension?
Basically, what does he want to do with China?
Okay, the question is about Dimitar's opinion of President Xi's goals.
well,
I'm not sure.
that's a hard one to address. I will, can I maybe say something that's pertinent to the book and then
Yeah.
give you kind of a more general comment? I think that Xi Jinping's approach to kind of giving a face to the party, his face to the party, kind of concentrating power, is arguably the single biggest threat to kind of the efficacy of the system that I describe in this book. Because the moment that you get kind of one individual that is responsible for kind of the vision of the country, the aspirations of the policy and the design of the, of the planning process, it becomes impossible to then collect objective input from the rest of society that might actually help those goals and those visions without inadvertently criticizing the person behind them, right? That's why I don't think that you could have this type of system in a place like North Korea. And unfortunately, I think as Xi Jinping kind of becomes the single face, then you're going to kind of, you're going to kill this golden goose in terms of an administrative tool. That's not what you were looking for. I think you wanted a more general opinion on Xi Jinping. I think that Xi Jinping was first and foremost empowered to be a strong leader by his colleagues. When he came into office, he was given a very strong deck of cards. And I think maybe, and this is typical, is that when you have a lot of power, you get kind of inflated by it. And I think that that's what's happening right now, is that you have somebody who was dealt a very strong hand that feels obligated to lay down a very strong legacy. And that's a dangerous situation.
Listening to the can't help but think of the book that's
Can you
probably,
speak up so that folks back
Okay.
home in the home audience can
Sure.
hear you?
I said I was, I kept thinking about the one book that had big impact on China, Samuel Huntington's book. And your analysis also reminds me of the kind of framework that he provides, that this sort of control, inclusion, in his case, participation versus institutionalization. Now, how similar is your approach to this China to Huntington's framework of analyzing political development or political decay? And if anything, are there possibilities of this system not working out and leading to political decay? You were pointing out one thing already, like she sort of trying to, what she's doing might be, impacting the efficacy of this system, leading to potential problems. So that's one question, but I have another question that's
One
about.
question at a
Okay.
time.
I have another
come
question that I
back
come
here.
back. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, no, I think that there are clear parallels here. This idea of, it's not the type of government, but the degree of government. I think that, I'm thinking along the same track. I guess in terms of institutionalization, the kind of the interesting part about, the control architecture in China is that it's not institutionalized, right? It's very ad hoc and it's very nimble. And so I don't necessarily think of this as a generalizable story about order and control. I think it's kind of a feature of the Chinese case insofar as that this is kind of a uniquely large organization, the CCP, a uniquely embedded organization and one that has profited from technology in kind of a unique way that has allowed it to kind of perpetuate these ad hoc controls throughout the system. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as the same sort of institutionalization, but I think that all regimes need the participation part, but I wouldn't say that this is an institutional blueprint that could be adopted by other countries in terms of pursuing political order.
Dimitar, many thanks for coming back. I have a question related to the title of your book. I caught sight of the word Leninism.
Yeah.
Every year, I think party officials and the academics at party school system, they write so much about isms. They are trying to do theoretical innovation. So the fact that they invest resource in such a task makes me think this might be a mechanism of control as well. But the question is, they're written in a language, in such an opaque language, it's hard for an average citizen like myself to penetrate. It's hard for an average civil servant or official that I have, met through family or by social circles. Am I right in thinking that this is a form of control? And if it is, who is the audience?
Okay, so do you think the folks could hear the question?
It seems like there was good, well, it's hard for me to tell, but I think
Okay.
so.
So your questions about the ideological dimension, and especially among the elite, in talking about different socialism with Xi Jinping's version of, I forget what you say, Xi Jinping's socialism with what?
The Xi thought of the
New era.
New era. And you be learning these concepts in this way.
Well, sure. I mean, I think this is propaganda is always a tool for control, and this rhetoric is part of the propaganda
But it's
process.
hard for people to understand. It's
Seems esoteric.
exactly.
obfuscating. It's just they keep inventing all these terms and isms and theories to the point where, ordinary people, all they do is just to memorize and regurgitate without really knowing what's inside. So is that type of political discourse, I have the same question, is that part of this control?
I think it's part of control, and I can tell you why. It's not part of my use of the word Leninism. But I have written about this in other papers about kind of the control functions of ambiguity. Right? So if you don't define the boundaries, if you don't define what your ism is, and you make it kind of esoteric, and it could mean many different things, people respond to ambiguity in a risk-averse way. And they tend to pull back further because they don't know exactly, well, am I out beyond the line? Have I violated the ism? And so I think that in that sense, then yes, that kind of muddy language is conducive to keeping people in line.
Yes.
So I read extensively about military civil fusion in a lot of white papers, this sort of progressive strategy to help maybe spread economic growth, help keep China on the top of emerging technologies. So have you encountered that in your research, and if so, what is your opinion on how that will sort of change the control dynamics or participation dynamics, especially between the business league in China?
Civil question about civil military fusion, which I'm not sure how it fits.
Yeah, I think that this is a different topic, but what we have seen under the Xi administration is a fundamental kind of restructuring of civil military relations and of the military complex itself, right? So we've seen a downsizing of the PLA, a reorganization of kind of theaters of command, and a strengthening of kind of direct control from the civilian side, which includes Xi Jinping's post as chairman of the Central Military Commission, over operational command within the military. So I think that was, I wish Tainan was here, but that was probably something that was long overdue, that type of restructuring and reform. And it's, I mean, it's credit to kind of Xi's authority that was able to kind of push through resistance within the military to make that happen. I'm not sure I see the connection though with.
So let's see if there are any questions from folks on the Zoom.
Sure, we had a question about whether you see the public participation infrastructure described in China as potentially producing better feedback on public sentiment compared to the way the US does political polling. So sort of a comparative with democracies question. How can we understand these sort of controlled inclusion mechanisms in contrast to democracies?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the way it was phrased, I don't think that polling in China is better than polling here. There's all sorts of reasons why it's very difficult to get kind of genuine responses from Chinese citizens, and I have to go out of my way designing survey questions with shielding techniques and experiments to try and tease out any kind of meaningful information. That said, I do think there is a potential conversation that needs to be had about the way we structure public kind of participation in public choice, right? So I make a distinction in the theory chapter of the book about kind of being included in deciding who governs, which is the way we tend to think about it here, versus how they govern. Right? And in China, there is no inclusion in who governs. Right? That is the sole prerogative of the party and the organization department. But the types of policy options that are in play, you know, the different redistribution outcomes that could occur, there is a role for that for the Chinese citizen to participate in that, and it's very controlled. It's very narrow. It's topic by topic. It's only during a brief period of time, right? But that is potentially a meaningful way of getting people to focus on a specific question, a specific policy agenda, and getting useful information out of it, rather than, you know, I'm going to sound cynical here, but, you know, a popularity contest on who you like more in a person-to-person competition.
I think that's the other question is the clarification question.
Well, yes.
Yeah, second one. I was thinking about whether at the time, I was thinking about if China, do you consider it is a rational choice for China to have a democratization reformation to make it better to be acceptable in dealing with US-China conflict? Because we know system design is a key reason driving US-China conflict. As China systematic design has been focused on statisticism and US system design starting point is individual. You consider.
So the question, I understand the question. The question is, would it be in China's national interest to move toward a more democratic political system in which you have elections, independent legal system, in part because it would reduce the conflict with democratic countries like the United States? Is that your question?
I think so.
Yeah.
But
So,
maybe also, would it be better for China's national interest, for Chinese people, or not?
so yeah, thank you, Susan, for paraphrasing also that you kind of preempted my snide remark, which is that the CCP already considers itself a democracy. But no, yeah, I mean, I think in
Well,
theory,
actually, recently has seems to be quite thin-skinned about the criticism of not being a democracy, and so has made a big point,
Yeah.
including in the joint statement with
the first,
Putin,
yeah, right at the beginning.
about it is a democracy by their own definition.
But I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, in theory, if China adopted political institutions that are in line with those of the West, it would make a whole host of interactions much easier, whether they're economic interactions, whether they're person-to-person interactions, and so yes, you could see the range of tension decreasing. That said, there are still kind of realist versions of competing national interests here at play, and I think that Chinese citizens, perhaps more so than American citizens, still see the world in that kind of more realist perspective, right? I've done some survey work that's not part of this book, where I ask Chinese citizens what they think about arguments like that, about a liberal China would be good for the Chinese people, and most of them respond by completely dismissing the argument and interpreting it as a cunning strategy by the West to try and undermine China's potential. And so in theory, yes, I agree with you. I don't see that being a likely outcome, nor do I think that it would fully resolve the competition and rivalry that we see between the Chinese state and the Chinese society and the American state and American society.
The conversation always remains that some people consider it is a rational choice to electronize on democracy.
Do I think it's a rational choice
Yes,
Or
for China to democratize?
choose, yeah.
try on democratization, try to reduce conflicts and build on conflict.
I don't know if it's my place to make that choice. Is it rational or not? We'd have to have a discussion on kind of what the basis of rationality is. Are we thinking simply in terms of income? In that case, it's a complicated question. Are we thinking about liberty? Then it's a very different answer, right? So I think our rationalities may not always align with one another.
Okay, and we have time for one more? or no?
We are past 5 o'clock, so we should
Oh, we're
probably wrap
past,
up.
okay. We're here in the room, so we can have these other questions after the talk, but thanks very much, Dimitar, for a very interesting talk, and thanks to everybody who joined us, and please join us again. Our next talk will be March 24th on the Tech War by Ling Chen from SAIS, and then Beijing's, oh, interesting, I didn't know he was doing that. Beijing's influence in the US with Isaac Stonefish, a very well-known journalist, columnist with the Washington Post. So thanks so much. Thank you.